Welcome to Democracy in the News. Today, as always, I'm going to do my channel update. We're going to do my what do I call it? Rewatch disclaimer, and then we'll go into all the different stories that I have for today. I want to talk about kind of related to my channel, but trying to be kind of a nonpartisan advocate for democracy in such a partisan era. I want to talk about the new mask off mandate that came down from the CDC, or the removal of the mask mandate. I want to talk about the vaccination of the Pfizer vaccine being approved for 12 to 15-year-olds. And then the headline story talking about Andrew Yang, former presidential and now mayoral candidate for New York City, and some news that he kind of brought onto himself and some attention he brought on himself, be it on purpose or not. And then my kind of B stories. I want to talk about what I call kind of perhaps the gaslighting of American voters by the media and Democrats regarding the Democratic agenda. Specifically, I want to center down on Democratic Senator Mark Warner and his support for the gig corporations and the gig economy in general, where I think that's kind of coming from. And then lastly, there's a story I thought was interesting, or actually just a tweet from a Politico reporter about Elizabeth Warren and Pramila Jayapal and their conversation after Jayapal endorsed Bernie Sanders. So that's the agenda for today. Of course, starting with my rewatch disclaimer. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm gonna probably, hopefully, by the time you watch it, there are going to be chapters at the bottom for each section, so that you can go in and click on the section that appeals to you. You can skip some of this channel stuff, which is more so for longtime viewers, or relatively long time. My channel is less than a year old. It'll actually be a year old, but this month or next month, something like that. But for relatively long time viewers, but then you can jump to the Yang story or to Senator Warner or anything else that you want to look at from the description or that sounds good. You can kind of mouse over it. It gives you all the titles, or click on a link in the description. If you're on Facebook, I'm sorry, there are no chapters there. I'd ask you to better watch it if you're on replay on YouTube rather than Facebook. That's more kind of helpful to me there. Facebook, I'm just kind of supporting for, all the people I know and my friends that sometimes watch this. I want to make it more accessible and make it difficult for people to see. And then, and if you're on YouTube and you're checking out for the first time, consider liking and subscribing. Okay, so today's channel update is going to be a little bit different. One shift that's kind of occurred in my channel has been that I've started to focus more on doing these weekly streams, kind of talking about the weekly news and how it relates to issues or concerns relating to democracy and civic engagement, and trying to put a lens on my particular lens on those various things. I want to continue to do that. And also, of course, I'm looking at doing some policy streams talking about specific national or state level politics. And I'll circle back on that in just a moment. Now, one shift internally inside of me regarding this is that I'm not focused as much on growing subscribers and trying to monetize at this point. Kind of realized that, I've also seen I've realized that that's kind of I kind of knew it was a long-term journey, but kind of how long-term that was and how much effort in the short term and how focused I really have to be on that to really get that accomplished, especially in the political area of YouTube that I'm in. If you're trying to do something that's more directed towards entertainment, that's really more suited for what YouTube is. And one thing I found is that, I'm a relatively serious person, and I'm not going to be as kind of entertaining to listen to as other commentators who, will make more light of things or make grander statements. I try to kind of generally stay reasoned and measured in what I say. And that doesn't necessarily make for as many clicks or as many views as it might otherwise. But I have to kind of be true to myself in terms of the way I look at things and the way I want to convey myself, through this camera. So that's part of it. And the other part is I have other projects, other things I'm working on as well. And I'd have to kind of shut those down and really, in order to make this work on politics, I probably have to kind of shut those down and really focus on what is happening with just YouTube. And I kind of decided that what was important to me was doing this and was doing what I'm doing. And if that doesn't bring quote unquote YouTube success, then so be it. but I'm going to focus on the value that I think I bring, even if it's not the most desired in YouTube. I don't want to try to become something else to be successful. It's more important to me to be myself and to convey what I'm interested in talking about. And so, having said that, where am I? I've lost track of where I am on my I lost track of where I was on my outline. So, as I said, my plan is to sustainably continue to do this stream and do policy streams as it's available. I hope y'all can hear me. I didn't mess anything up here. And but I want to kind of just continue the conversation I have on my streams about what I'm trying to accomplish. The value project, the value add that I thought I brought and been most successful to me in YouTube has been talking about the California propositions I did back in October, November. That's really blew my channel up. I had 2 viral videos, which kind of happenstance. There was something that were interesting to me that I talked about that I guess a lot of people didn't talk that much about, and was able to, and those are kind of slowly petering out over time now. But that was what seemed to, generally the value proposition that I thought made the most sense for what I'm trying to do was the one talking about California propositions. And so the next California election that comes up, I'm definitely I plan on doing that and doing summaries on those again. Now maybe I'll do some from other states and I'll expand it some. That seems to be something that is a niche and a need that needs to get filled that isn't already being filled on YouTube. So that's, as much as I might be ambitious, it would be on something like that where I think that I can give a good value add to people for watching the videos. So that's just the update. This is an evolving process, and this might change in a few months. And I appreciate the subs that I have, and I've kind of shifted to this streaming focus, and the subs haven't gone away, which I appreciate. So I want to just continue this, and that means to me that most of the people that are subs are because they like me, not maybe some of the things that I tried out that weren't as much me. So we'll see how that goes. Now, one aspect of this channel that I was really been trying to do that has been difficult is that I imagined this channel as a nonpartisan advocacy or advocates, the channel, I guess, or me, of democracy and civil engagement. That's something that I think is important for the health of any democracy, is getting people involved and getting them not just voting, but also organizing, be it in unions or in just grassroots organizations like I've done in the past and I'm currently doing. And so it was important to me to try to kind of create a space for that on YouTube. It's been kind of difficult to imagine and sometimes crystallize that in terms of videos to make, or that's why I kind of thought maybe streams would be better because you can get more back and forth with people in theory if you can build an audience. I've built a small audience, not to be a large one, but with that, people can ask questions, you can get that back and forth, and hopefully they can inspire people to get more involved, because democracy, it isn't enough to just vote. That's the mechanism of it. But to really make it healthy, you have to take an effort to be informed and to try to be engaged with your fellow citizens and share, what is important to you with them. That kind of affects and influences the body politic and the zeitgeist, and that's how movements are formed, and that's how change occurs. And so I wanted to encourage that, and I'm going to continue to do so. But the nonpartisan aspect is getting kind of difficult. And there's 2 reasons for that. The first reason is that YouTube needs a lot of content to really be successful. And honestly, sometimes in terms of that very narrow thing that I just defined, generating content can be difficult. That's how I came up with democracy in the news and trying to just look at news in general through the lens of democracy and the lens of civic engagement. That's how the stream kind of initially, to some extent, came about, is if I do it this way, maybe that'll help in real time develop it. But coming up with, long tail keywords and the kind of YouTube stuff that I kind of learned through trying to educate myself on how YouTube works is difficult to do for this subject. That's the first thing. And so once you start talking about politics, you start talking about politicians, and you give opinions about liberals and conservatives and Democrats and Republicans, and Green Party, and the People's Party, and all this stuff. And once you start talking about that, people look at you and say you're being partisan. But that's one thing. And to that I say, as long as I'm true to myself and I don't believe things and don't state things because a Democrat said it or because a Green Party person says it, but because it's my earnest belief based on my independent thought and not kind of following a party like a lemming, then I don't consider myself partisan for that reason. But there's another problem. The Republican Party, whose support for small d democracy has always been a bit tenuous, especially with the Southern strategy, has turned even further away from the basic concepts of small d democracy. You know, you've got the voter ID push in various states, even though there's no data that supports the necessity of voter ID. It's pushed because with the intentional goal of decreasing the number of people that actually vote, because one of the kind of Republican mantras is that the fewer people vote, the better chance they have of winning. Now, this isn't necessarily even supported by data, but it is something you can go back and find quotes by Republican politicians and thought leaders over the past 20 to 30 years that have expressed that. And specifically, they look at the different groups of people that do or don't have voter ID very easily. Sometimes they select for different types of voter ID. So they'll say you have a law that says no to college IDs, but yes to gun registrations, for example. You know, things like that try to skew the who is voting by affecting the voter ID that's required. There's also the issue whether or not that's a poll tax, which is undemocratic. You know, if you're making people spend money to get IDs, then you're making them essentially pay money to vote. There's also the aggressive purging of voter rolls. And if you don't know what purging of voter rolls is, the basic idea is that you try to say, okay, if people aren't active enough in voting, you take their names off of the people that receive voting information every time there's an election in a given city or state or what have you, any kind of municipality or group and county, any kind of group that votes. And so by doing that, you lessen likely the number of people who are going to vote, because there are going to be people that show up that thought they could vote and were registered but aren't registered. And you get situations that people don't even know. I called somebody up a few months ago. I was doing phone calls for Daniel Lee for a state Senate position here in California. And I called somebody, I'm talking to him for 5 or 10 minutes. He didn't even know there was an election that was taking place. Now, part of that's on him for not being as informed enough, but there are also mechanisms of the state that help keep people informed of elections. Not everybody watches the news every night. And as a person who's an advocate for democracy, it's generally in the state's interest to keep their electorate informed of voting, keep the electorate informed of when it's time to vote. And this person was not informed. This is in California. This person was not informed of vote. He may have been removed from the voting rolls. He may not have voted for a few times and they took him off. But there are other types of purges that are no more pernicious. There's things where somebody dies with a common name. And so they purge everybody off the voting roll with that name, even if there's no other proof that that person died. So someone died named Daniel Rodriguez. Well, if they go and say, I'm going to do a voter purge based on that, and they purge every Daniel Rodriguez, or if they only have one and they don't know if it's the right one or not, and they just go ahead and purge them, well, that person may not be able to vote or may have a more difficult time voting when the time comes. They may not be informed of the vote. So you have voter purges. And of course, the last thing, the most recent thing, was what happened on January 6th. I'm not talking about the riot. I'm talking about the congressional Republicans that voted first to challenge the electoral votes, which is something, Democrats have, I think back in 2004 did that, maybe 2000, they wanted to do it in 2000, 2004. So that in itself isn't too bad. But then they went on to actually vote, many Republicans to vote in favor of actually throwing away electoral votes in favor of having Congress spin those electoral votes. So essentially it was throwing away they voted Republicans, congressional Republicans, I think a majority voted, I think at least in the House, to throw away electoral votes and therefore millions of votes from certain states. And something that's, even electoral college itself isn't particularly different, democratic. That's especially undemocratic considering there was no real evidence of mass voter fraud. There was rumors of it. There was a suggestion of it, but there was no real reason to do that aside from partisanship, because those states had congressional, there the congressional groups in total were majority Republicans. So Republicans knew if we vote them out, if we vote out throw away the electoral votes, then the congressional, the group of all the Congress members, of all the House members would vote in favor of Donald Trump, even though the voters went in favor of Biden. And so when you do that, you're essentially undermining the will of the people. Very undemocratic. So it's getting very difficult trying to not really point the finger at Republicans and say anti-democratic now, because of all things, not just the usual things that were based more so on, ethnic and things, but just on the basic or different like ethnic groups or different groups of entities that are different. I can't think of the word for it. It's the different types of groups. I can't think of the word. Demographics. I could not think of the word demographics. Not based just on demographics, but just the general idea of power is power. And if they had the power to do it, just go ahead and do it, even if it undermines the will of the people. And we see it from both parties in gerrymandering. We see it primarily from Republicans in terms of actually trying to keep people from voting, especially of certain demographics, and adjusting laws to affect those demographics. And then now with January 6th, actually just naked power grab or attempt at a naked power grab. And fortunately, that stuff didn't work. And that's the thing about it. What happened on January 6th is, yes, I'm saying that, in theory, the idea is if they get a majority, then they can actually have Congress determine the electoral votes for those states. But they knew they didn't have the votes. So for the most part, those votes were just virtue signaling that, hey, we're on Trump's side, even though we know we're going to lose. But it does raise the question of, sometimes you do things like a kid does things, politicians do things to see how much pushback there is, how much people get upset about it. And with the January 6th stuff, I doubt many of those Congress members are going to face any blowback for what they did. And so as a result, there really is a question of if they'd be willing to actually do it, if they did have the majority to swing the Electoral College, if we have Biden, Trump, in 2024 again, which I think both of them are running. I'm more sure about Biden than Trump. Trump, I think, depends on a lot of factors that we don't know the answers to right now. But if it's back to them and it comes down, say, to Arizona, and the congressional delegation of Arizona is Republican, but Arizona goes for Biden again, if they'll say, I don't know, there's rumors about possible, vote stuff, and we don't know what's happening right now. So you know what? We're going to let Congress decide it. And Congress picks the president. We've already had the Supreme Court do it in 2000. Having Congress, in this case, pick the president, even more directly, have congressional Republicans swing the election through Arizona. It's a possible scenario, and it's not one that I can dismiss out of hand. Because, in part, the lack of accountability that those Republican Congress members are probably going to face for the votes they took back on January 6th. So, and related to just what happened in the news this week with Liz Cheney being kicked out of her leadership position among Republicans, basically because she wouldn't support the whole Stop the Steal agenda and the agenda of the talking points that Republicans are pushing about, elections are problematic and that's why we need these new rules and we need to keep the wrong people from, all this massive voter fraud and that whole storyline. She's not pushing that storyline and she's very anti-Trump at this point. They kicked her out. And this is a guy that's not even elected office anymore that's facing possible federal charges and they're still kowtowing to him and to the almost necessary anti-democratic means to actually put him back in place. Because I think because of how badly he did with dealing with the coronavirus, this COVID-19, the majority of Americans aren't going to vote for him again. He lost by, I think, 11 million votes. Monster loss. I mean, I think a bigger loss in the history of this country. So maybe Reagan and Carter or something, or Reagan and Mondale. It's hard to believe that he's going to be able to win a majority. So it's going to require anti-democratic shenanigans to place him back in office in 2024. So there's a question about whether or not what the Republicans are willing to do. And it seems to be more and more. They're pushing the envelope, the anti-democratic envelope right now in terms of policy. And in terms of, using the mechanisms of existing federal law to try to acquire power. And that's authoritarianism. That's not democracy. And that makes it hard to not talk about Republicans in this way. At least, and when I say Republicans, I mean elected representatives, individual people. I'm not talking about conservatives, because American people, I think, by and large, believe in democracy. Even the most conservative person would agree that the person that gets the most votes should win an election. I might be able to try to cajole them with rumors of election issues to go along with their conservative representative in doing undemocratic shenanigans. But in their core, in their hearts, I think democracy is very deeply embedded in the spirit of this country. And it takes lies and deceit and trickery and a relatively unrepresentative government, one that is partially beholden to money rather than people, in order for this type of undemocratic nonsense to work. So it makes it hard to be nonpartisan. I try not to talk too much about, I honestly don't talk a lot about Republicans because they're not the party in power, but they're just sitting back there, and they're not in power at the federal level, and they're not in power in the state that I live in. But they are in power in a lot of states, and they are doing a lot of stuff to try to keep themselves in power and to expand their power. And a lot of those things are pretty undemocratic, small d democratic. So it raises my concern. I wanted to kind of address it here because I don't always talk about it a lot. I'm focused more on Democrats because there are some Democrats that I agree a great deal with in terms of policy, and some that I don't agree with hardly at all. And so I tend to focus on that difference. And on that party, the one seemingly functional party in this country, actually passing laws and trying to fix the problems that we have in our society, because so many of them aren't being addressed, like climate change, like the mass incarceration. We incarcerate so many more people than anywhere else in the world, even China or India. It's not even per capita. I think we physically have more people in prison here than they have in almost any country, except I think China may be slightly ahead of us, but it's just our per capita is through the roof. And so we deal with that. Like so many of them are nonviolent. They don't need to be in prison. And some of the stuff that they get convicted for isn't even illegal anymore. And there's laws that are stuck in Congress to try to exonerate the people that are in prison for laws they violated that aren't law anymore. So, that's the question is, will the one party that can seemingly has the ability to govern make good law and improve our society, or will they not be undermined by the conservative party in this country and or their own conservative members? Okay, so just announced today, I had to add this to my schedule right at the end, but just announced today, the CDC actually announced, I wrote on my outline here, I have Biden announced, he talked about, he gave like a speech on the garden, the South Garden, the North Garden, whatever it is. But the CDC announced that they changed their mask guidance to say that if you are fully vaccinated, so if you have the double vaccine, you've had the 2 shots, you've had both, or it's J&J, just the one. If you're fully vaccinated, you don't need to wear your mask indoors. And Biden touted that. He kind of came out of the White House without a mask on, as I understand it, and big up this, and then talk about how we got to keep on getting people vaccinated. Now, I am a bit cynical about this in the sense that I'm doubtful that anything really changed in the last few weeks in terms of data that led them to do this. I think they just kind of were being cautious and just said, okay, we need to go ahead and pull the trigger. There's a lot of talk in certain areas of lockdowns again, and they need some kind of like carrot and stick situation, trying to offer a carrot to people to get the vaccination. And I think they're saying, hey, look, you're sick of wearing the mask. Just get vaccinated. You don't have to wear them anymore. And there also was a lot of right-wing talk about, if the vaccine works, why I got to wear the mask, right? Now, of course, the reason why is because the vaccinations individually are not 100%. And so even if you get vaccinated, there's still a chance you could still get it. And then if you're indoors, if you have it, you can still pass it around, even if your symptoms aren't as bad because you're vaccinated. You still could theoretically get it. But there's not a lot of data that people who are vaccinated pass it around at all. But that was the theory, is that individual vaccination doesn't protect everybody. It's that by vaccinating everybody, you get herd immunity in small groups and then hopefully nationally eventually. But that's the challenge. I've talked about that in previous weeks. The numbers do not bear out an easy path to herd immunity. Like we're going to get the 60% full or even 65 pretty easily. But that last 10, 15, 20% to get the 75, 80%, 85% nationally is going to be very difficult. And I think part of this was instead of just using the stick, let's do some carrot and say, hey, if you're in, I think it's supported by the data. Hey, if you're fully vaccinated, you can go ahead and not wear the mask anymore. Now, I wonder, of course, if people who aren't vaccinated are going to stop wearing masks. I think that's a probable concern as well. We'll see. I'm actually going to probably at least somewhat, will be fully vaccinated next week or by next week. And I'll probably still wear masks sometimes when I'm inside. It depends on the situation, but I don't know how comfortable I am, and what COVID does, it messes you up. So I still might be extra cautious. Now, having said this, the CDC guidance changed, but also your state actually may have its own mandates. It may have its own policy and law regarding whether or not to use the mask. So make sure and look at that before you start running around with no mask on, even if you're fully vaccinated. So this is the CDC issuing guidance that then gets heard by the various states and hopefully followed. All right, next story. Okay. On a related note, the Pfizer vaccine was approved for 12 to 15-year-olds. I guess it was approved over 15 already. I don't remember noticing that, but okay. So 12 and up, essentially, unless for some reason 16-year-olds can't get it. That's hard to think that. So now, one thing that I'm not surprised to see this happen, and the reason is because, as I spoke of just a moment ago, we still need to get to herd immunity. And now in certain areas, like I'm in Southern California, probably a pretty good chance we're going to reach it in a relatively short time. I think our vaccination rates have been very good. But in some parts of the country and for the country overall, the number isn't quite as good. And that last 20% is going to be difficult. And so I think part of this idea is to get that last 20% by now starting to vaccinate kids, because kids are 20% of our population. Even 100% of adults is only 80% vaccination. So you've got to get some kids getting vaccinated. And so that's why I'm not surprised to see this happen. Now, one kind of tertiary concern I have here is the biggest concern I have with COVID-19 pandemic at this point is that there are other countries that have had big outbreaks like India, like South Africa, whose vaccination rates are not very good. And I worry about America being so concerned about our herd immunity that we're taking too much of the vaccine and not leaving enough for other countries. Now, I don't know the detailed logistics. I'm not trying to point fingers. I'm just saying I'm thinking, is it as important that 12-year-olds in the United States get vaccinated as it is for adults and elderly people in India and South Africa to get vaccinated? This relates somewhat to that issue about the patents. That's kind of murky too, because you've got one side saying that, their equipment won't work and we got to train them. They don't know how to make the vaccine, so the patent doesn't matter. Then the other side saying, well, some people, we've had reports in news stories about organizations say they're ready to start producing it now. They just need the patents, the TRIPS patent waiver from the WTO, and they can roll. So that's a mess there. But right now, the point is the vaccine, not but so much can be made at a time. And it seems like now we in the US have plenty, but these other parts of the world have these huge outbreaks where mutations are happening. And if a mutation occurs that our vaccines don't cover, we're back at square one. And that's where I don't want to be. And because the actual transference and lethality for kids is so low, it just seems odd to me that we have this problem of not having enough vaccine in these other high outbreak countries. And meanwhile, we seem to have plenty for whoever wants them. And I don't know, from a standing back and looking at the entire Earth perspective, if that's the best distribution structure for the world in terms of preventing the pandemic from continuing on for years and years, which is my ultimate concern. Ultimately, I can't control that, and I'll make the decision for my daughter, myself. I can't meet her not taking it won't change whether or not they in South Africa can take it or they in India can take it. But I do worry. I hear that news and I worry about them, and on both a self-interest of mutations, but also the non-self-interest of they're in the middle of serious outbreaks. A lot of people are dying there. And there's some people still dying here, but there are a lot dying there. And I feel like more should or can be done than is. And I worry about them having scarcity when we seem to not have it at this point. Next story. So the lead story today, and this is a lot, and I'm going to try to not lose track of where I am in this outline. But the big story for today I want to talk about is Andrew Yang. Now I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to pull up this tweet that he did. Let me see here. Andrew Yang. We're going to share the screen. I thought I did this already. Share screen. Pick this screen. Boom. Bam. There it is. Oh. So Andrew Yang, was it yesterday? May 10th. It seemed like it was like yesterday, but I guess it kind of, went viral. He said, "I'm standing with the people of Israel who are coming under bombardment attacks and condemn the Hamas terrorists. The people of NYC will always stand with our brothers and sisters in Israel who face down terrorism and persevere." So he did that, and he got a lot of pushback, both from regular people and from politicians. The reason being fundamentally that he seemed to be siding fully with Israel and justifying their bombardment with Palestine and not showing any sympathy for the innocent civilians that are killed in part as a result of that bombardment. Not even making judgment about whether or not Israel should do it at all or not, but simply showing absolutely no concern in his tweet about that. Now, I'm just going to come back to me. I'm gonna pop back to me, boom, and then I'm gonna go back to my thing. All right. So, and ultimately, in the last day or so, he's walked that comment back a bit. Now, me personally, I'll just say up front, I've never been a huge fan of Andrew Yang. He came across as a sincere guy, as a nice guy, but he was kind of a one-issue candidate, and his one issue was UBI, or universal basic income, the idea of giving some amount of money to everybody as a part of citizenship around the country. And in principle, as a concept, I didn't have a problem with it, but it was never seemingly thought out well enough. And when he would talk about it and discuss it, although his justification for it, the increasing automation and jobs that aren't coming back and what have you, seemed in some sense to justify it, I always found two fundamental issues with it. One, it didn't seem to be enough money for anybody to live off of. It's something that, okay, that's going to help, but if you don't have a job in most cities, almost anywhere, the $2,000 a month, which is what he was talking about. Or actually, so 2,000 was at 1,000. Let's say even 2,000. It may only been 1,000. I think it was actually 1,000 a month was his UBI. 1,000 a month. Yes, 1,000. 1,000 a month isn't enough to actually live off of. So if automation is taking your jobs are gone forever, then the UBI is supposed to be solving that problem, but it's not solving it because you're not being given enough money to replace the job you don't have. You're given like side money, like if suddenly gig economy went away, you only had your main job and you're using a gig, you're using an Uber to make an extra G a month, then that would help you. Now, so that's one problem, is it didn't seem to solve the problem, which he described, I think, effectively and made a good point about. The other problem was he oftentimes was not willing to tax significantly enough to pay for it. So as I said, it's not enough money, but even amongst the money he had, the way he wanted to try to pay for it relatively cheaply is by cutting other social safety net programs and making people choose the UBI or the targeted benefits that may even be more than $1,000 that are, say, specific to, be it food stamps or money to assist, being able to pay rent or whatever it may be, or, because you're disabled or something. And on one point, early on, I think he kind of walked this back too. And he was talking to some person who was relatively libertarian. I want to say maybe Joe Rogan, but it was somebody who had libertarian tendencies. And they said to him, "Hey, why are you, doing this way?" And he kind of said in part that he wanted to, and I don't remember how much the person egged him on in this way, but he said in part that, well, we want to kind of shrink the government. We want to make the kind of like the welfare state smaller, and a UBI kind of does that. So it's almost like he kind of said the quiet part loud, like he's really trying to use the UBI as a sort of Trojan horse. Now later on he walked it back, but really he never fundamentally changed the approach, because let's say it's a UBI. Let's say your purpose really is to replace the fact that people have a hard time finding jobs because of automation. Well, what you would do is you would then tax corporations that used automation in order to generate the wealth to then distribute to the community that's a result. So basically, you would take some of that productivity that corporations are getting by using automation and use it to fund UBI. That makes perfect sense. You're essentially taxing their productivity because that's what you do. Your wage is in part your cut of productivity from the owner of the business that's paying you. And so if you're not going to have that anymore, well, or America as a society is not going to have that, that seems like where the money to pay for it should come from. So anyway, so my issue was always that his one issue was not well thought out. And I'm wondering, why am I listening to this guy? I actually looked into his background. You can go to Wikipedia and it actually breaks down kind of different stages of his life. And he's not like Elon Musk, somebody, or Mark Cuban, somebody who essentially got on the .com stuff and was part of the right company. Like I think Elon Musk was PayPal, Mark Cuban was broadcast.com. They get bought up and suddenly you're a multi-hundred millionaire or a billionaire. He's not that. He's connected to Silicon Valley and he does have enough wealth that he started running for president in like 2017 for the 2020 election. So he's somebody that interjected himself kind of from that community into politics, but it's not as someone that had been so or particularly successful so much as somebody who knew the right people and was able to kind of get himself publicity and spend the time that it takes to kind of develop publicity in a very kind of from the bottom way, running a campaign, because most people declare presidency like a year out. He did essentially 3 years out. And so he's not that guy. And so there is a real question, I think, in my mind, but especially that the UBI as his core conceit or core concept isn't even that great, why he's such a big deal. Now, of course, he's famous. And so he's running for mayor, but he's running for mayor primarily as a famous guy. Like, Caitlyn Jenner running for governor in California. He's a famous person. In this case, he's famous for running for president. In Caitlyn Jenner's case, it's for the Olympics and then keeping up the Kardashians, et cetera. And so that becomes, so the question in my mind is, what to make of him ultimately as a candidate for mayor or for president. And this doesn't bode well for him. Now, on the surface, what I took his initial tweet to be was essentially pandering to the Jewish population of New York City. Say something nice about, Israel, was attacked by Hamas, fires back. I'm gonna support Israel. See, I'm team Jews. So all the Jews in New York who I'm running for mayor, and I think even the way he tweeted with a special point of mentioning the Jewish. Let me see if I have it. Let me pull it back up. Let me see it. Bring it back up here. So he said, "The people of NYC will always stand with our brothers and sisters in Israel." So it seems pretty straightforward pandering, which isn't the worst thing in the world. Plenty of politicians do it, but that seemed like what it was. But what he did was he stepped in some caca when he did it. Now, recently, he's not one to refuse much publicity. So recently he actually went on a podcast hosted by two kind of YouTube stars, Crystal Ball from Rising on the Hill and Kyle Kalinske of the Secular Talk channel, which hosts his show, the Kyle Kalinske Show. I always thought it was odd, like the channel is called the Secular Talk, but then behind him on the wall is the Kyle Kalinske Show. So I never know how to refer to it. Like, am I watching the Kyle Kalinske Show or am I watching Secular Talk? I think he rebranded and just didn't change the channel because of YouTube. But anyway, so they're interviewing him and they start going at him. Like, these are some real progressives. They have sincere progressive thoughts and on definitely my perspective. And so generally the progressive approach is to look at both sides and say, hey, to look both Palestinians and at Israel and say, what aren't you doing that you could do to maybe handle things better? Although most progressives generally think that Israel is the one with the power. And so ultimately they're the ones in control. And relating to that, the BDS movement or BDS, which is, boycott, BD, divest, and sanction, is a concept that was used successfully in South Africa to fight against apartheid, because apartheid was part of the government, part of the process of was a legal regime that put white people above the darker skinned people and much bigger population of South Africa. And we saw as clearly as most Americans saw it clearly as something that was bad and shouldn't be. So we, as Americans, individually or as companies, boycotted organizations or entities that did business with South Africa. We asked the government to sanction South Africa, and then we asked businesses to divest themselves from business interests in South Africa. And so now with the two-state solution, which everybody kind of theoretically wants, except probably for Israel, with that seemingly being undermined by Israel's policy as it relates to the occupied territories, there are some, including an organization called the BDS movement, but also just individual Congress members that just talk about it as an idea, like terrorism. It's something it's a way of doing something. It's an approach to political movement or political effectiveness to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel for what's going on, because they're the ones in power. And so even though you can certainly point at the flaws and errors and mistakes of the Palestinians and decry the terrorism of Hamas, an entity that exists in Palestine, you can also then still say Israel are the ones with the army. They're the ones who most people kind of know have nuclear weapons and really aren't in danger of not existing, really, in a sense. If anybody really tried to take them over, they have, the world's biggest military by far in America has their back. They're in charge. And these things, this two-state solution or any solution that ends what would fairly be described as an apartheid state for Palestinians in the occupied territories, the only way for that to end is through the movement and direction of Israel. Otherwise, things aren't going to change. And what we're seeing instead is an atrophy and a slow taking and overriding of the territory that Palestinians currently reside in by Israeli settlements, settlements that are considered by the UN to be violation of law. And the missile attacks that Andrew Yang big upped in his tweet were actually decried by even some churches in Israel. So they were, and that's one thing that's interesting about this whole situation, is that the media, which has generally had Israel's back and really, talking to family members, like they generally hear Israel's side of it and not Palestine's side. I mean, there are two sides to this at the very least. And then people generally hear Israel's side, but you're actually seeing on mainstream news both sides of this now. And you're seeing politicians, and not just the ones of Muslim descent, but even people like AOC, saying, trying to point out Israel's power and their ability to be better than they are on this issue. And so anyway, so I'm saying, having said all that, so Yang goes on the show and they ask him about BDS, and he refers to it as an organization multiple times. And he says the organization hasn't decried some of Hamas's acts or something. Like, he's an organization. And so at one point, Kyle Kalinske, I think he was wondering if Andrew Yang knew what the words BDS meant. So at one point, he actually says to him, instead of saying BDS, he kind of almost asked the same question again. He says, how do you feel about the idea of the approach of boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel? And he still went back to this organization, and I have a problem with the organization. And Yang never really engaged on these concepts, on the even concept of doing a boycott, of sanctions, of divestment. He kept on circling on that. And, Kalinske then tried to go and say, oh, what if we just did it to the occupied territories and businesses that work there that are supporting this? And even that he wouldn't go along with. But it seemed a real question to me, and I think to Kyle Kalinske too, although obviously he wasn't trying to embarrass the guy, because I think they kind of liked him too. And there are things I like about Andrew Yang. I mean, in terms of, it seems like generally a real, regular person that's trying to be in politics. I just think that you have to question, who are they listening to? And one thing's been pointed out to me is that his campaign is backed in part by the police unions in New York. And one thing that he's for in New York is not decreasing the size of police departments and their budgets at all. And they're gigantic in New York. So that's another problem, is I'm afraid he might be a useful idiot. Somebody that comes across very well, but the financial interests that back him are kind of pulling the marionette strings. And we saw when they try to get real with him and say, okay, look, how do you feel about boycotts? What do you think about? And try to engage him intellectually. instead of responding intellectually, he gave them back talking points. He gave them back not quotes or something that you can talking points. So that's the thing. And it's difficult. People, there are some progressives that hate when people say it's a complicated situation. And I think in a sense, they're right in that it's clear from anybody you can look at this, who has the power in that situation between Israel and Palestine. What's complicated is what exactly I think we should be asking of Israel beyond, obviously not, responding almost like tenfold to any attack by Hamas, because Hamas, not every Palestinian is in favor of them. So it's kind of like you're killing people who are innocent of doing anything. And even though Hamas is a terrorist, I don't know if it's really okay to respond terror with terror, right? And so you have to, but in general, I think the complex situation with Israel is what, with us as a country, as America, I'm speaking as an American, is what to demand and how to get Israel to move forward in a two-state solution rather than slowly edging towards this one-state apartheid state and maintaining it and just propagating until the occupied territories are completely devoid of Palestinians, which it seems like if you just look at it and say, if this just goes on for another 100 years, eventually it'll just all be Israel. And you get the feeling like that's what Israel wants, and they're willing to play this political game to keep America's support by not just, annexing it by physical force, but just slowly through atrophy and the small things that happen and are done, slowly turn the occupied territories into extensions of Israel until the Palestinians they're all filled with Israeli settlements and the Palestinians are gone. And it looks more and more like that's the hidden agenda, even though on the surface, you can say in any moment, oh, Hamas attacked, so Israel responded. Of course, Hamas attacked because Israel did something on a smaller scale that nobody reported. But that's the media thing that has to change, is that when Israel does things they shouldn't be doing on a small scale, like with the settlements, and I think there was like a Palestinian church or mosque or something that got destroyed or got attacked or damaged or something, or there was some event that there was some like parade or something. There's something that happened there was some disruption or problem that happened that was spurred on by Israeli forces that Hamas responded to, that then Israel responded. It was almost like in basketball when the ref only sees the reaction. We've been that ref over and over again. And we have to look, when there are no missiles being fired by Hamas, look at day to day what Israel is doing to either move towards a two-state solution or move towards an ultimately one Israel solution with as much apartheid in the short term as necessary until the Palestinians are gone and become refugees somewhere else or something, which is, as I said, that's happening as the settlements illegally push further and further into the occupied territories. So I don't think Yang knows about this stuff. Like, I feel like he just said this he's probably told by some consultant to say this to appeal to, Jews in New York City, because that's like the most populous place for Jews in America besides Israel itself. So as a pander, and he stepped in it, and now there's this whole big thing. So Yang, I had a video. I'm going to move on to the next things. I've been talking about this for a while, but I'll just say this: he's doing very well in the polls. There's no great candidate. There was one candidate who was like probably the most progressive. I think Stringer was his name or something, but he had like a minor scandal and kind of got possibly Me Too'd. Although I think was it The Intercept kind of looked at the claims and found they didn't really make sense. And then the person, I think there's a black candidate named Evans, who is neck and neck with Yang, but just doesn't have the name recognition. But he is fairly popular. I think he's represents Brooklyn in some way. But Yang might be the next mayor of New York. And if he does, it certainly won't be any progress forward on reforming or defunding or in any way improving New York Police Department. It'll be more of the same. And I think he proposed like some ridiculously tiny UBI in New York of like $1,000 a year or something. But what's that going to do? That just seems silly. it seems like you're trying to, put a round peg in a square hole there. But we'll see what happens. The election, I think, is only in a few weeks. So we'll see. Yes. Interesting. So there's been a lot of news this week about several bills that are part of like the agenda of the Democratic Party. There's the For the People Act, HR 1, which is now also S1. There's the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which seeks to restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 after it was gutted by the fifth Title V was removed, or Part 5 of it was removed by the Supreme Court. The PRO Act, the Pro-Union PRO Act, and the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And there was specifically some news about Clyburn, Congressman Clyburn, negotiating with Republican Tim Scott, who has been talking about his version of a policing act as well, and whether or not he's willing to sacrifice removing qualified immunity from policemen. And Clyburn was like, basically said yes, he was willing to. And it got me thinking. So when he did that, it got me thinking like, okay, you're negotiating with this Tim Scott guy. That's the black guy that did, black congressman, black senator that did the response to Biden a few weeks back. And you're negotiating with him. Does he have 9 other Republican senators that are on board if you agree, if you make this negotiation? Because that's something I see sometimes is Democrats doing stuff that they really don't want to do and negotiating it away quickly, even though there's no real guarantee that that's going to get them anything. So, you got Tim Scott. Let's say you have all the other quote unquote reasonable Republicans are on board. Romney, Murkowski from Alaska, and Collins from Maine, who's in a Democratic state. I don't know how she keeps getting elected. Let's say them. That's 5 people. That's 55. That does it. All the bills I named are require removing the filibuster or reaching a 60 vote threshold to surpass the filibuster 60 vote threshold. And so I'm wondering here with this Clyburn and Tim Scott talk, do they have 9 other votes I don't know about? I don't think they do. And I wonder for all these bills, there's been recent talk about the For the People Act. In fact, there was a big thing of Senator Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and the Minority Leader in the Senate. What's his name? Turtle Face. What's his name? I can't remember, the minority leader, Republican minority leader of the Senate, whose name I can picture his face, but I can't think of his name, going to this committee hearing about the For the People Act and arguing out it with the cameras and everything. And I'm sitting here thinking, okay, this is nice. And it didn't make it out to 9 votes, would make it out of committee. I'm like, well, what if it did? It just get filibustered. Am I missing something? It seems it kind of feels like there's much ado about nothing, that the Democrats are, and even the Republicans are playing along, making big stinks about these bills, if they're good, if they're bad. I'm going to talk a little bit about the PRO Act and Senator Mark Warner's comments about that. Again, it requires 60 votes, I think. So if all these do, some of them definitely do. The For the People Act definitely requires 60 votes. The PRO Act, because it's related to unionizing and that kind of stuff, maybe. But if the minimum wage wasn't considered viable for reconciliation, I don't see how that was. Voting Rights Act isn't reconciliation. George Floyd policing, I don't think is reconciliation. So this stuff does not apply to reconciliation. They are blocked by the filibuster. So I see all this news about these bills. All I can think is that it's almost like it's a gaslight. And that term is kind of, I like to use that term for this because it's almost like it's trying to get us excited. Like gaslighting is often referred to by trying to say stuff to people in a relationship that makes them feel sad. That's not true, to like mess with them. But I'm thinking about almost the other way. Like they're almost trying to get Democrats excited about these, even though unless the filibuster goes away, none of this stuff is happening. So I kind of feel like it's trying to gaslight us, anybody in favor of these policies, pro-union, pro-Voting Rights Act, pro, police reform, get us all excited when there's nothing really happening here. The minority leader, the Republican minority leader, already said there's no votes for infrastructure, and that doesn't even require 60 votes. And that's something that's infrastructure, that's spending money. And Republicans are saying they're not for it, but they're going to be for restoring the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They're going to be for, not defunding the police, but requiring cameras and removing qualified immunity and all this kind of, you can get 10 votes from that from Republicans. It seems ridiculous. Now, the reality is actually much, much worse, because another story that came out today, I think today or yesterday, was that Biden was talking one-on-one with Manchin about the infrastructure bill. So it looks like the Democrats are possibly having problems even getting 50 votes for an infrastructure bill. If you know, and that's something that we all kind of took for granted, that, oh, they'll at least be able to get their votes for things like infrastructure from all the Democrats. And I mean, you could throw all kind of money at Manchin for West Virginia. Like, are you really going to have a problem? And it seemed to be the sticking point is taxes, corporate taxes. That Joe Manchin, from a very blue collar state of West Virginia, is going to die on the hill of corporate taxes in order to undermine it's called the jobs bill, but it's really an infrastructure bill. It's spending on infrastructure to create jobs. He's going to do that in that state to the point that Joe Biden has to go to him and try to cajole him at the White House. I mean, that's where Democrats really are, is that it's hurting cats. They're having enough trouble just trying to get an infrastructure bill to spend money in a moderate increase in corporate taxes over a 50-state barrier. And they've got us thinking here that, oh, we're going to pass the For the People Act or the PRO Act or a Federal Policing Act. It seems ludicrous to me. It seems like Joe Biden's first term, or at least the first half of his first term, may almost be over in terms of legislation, in terms of really changing any real course of this country, with nothing on climate change, nothing on voters' rights. Meanwhile, at the state level, Republicans are doing everything they can to undermine, to lower turnout and to undermine certain the people of certain demographics' abilities to vote. It's kind of worrisome. It's this first 100 days, there seems to be some momentum there. It's gonna be, oh, this infrastructure bill is gonna be coming right up. Now, kind of don't think so. I think that we might be looking at, soon a slow march to the midterms. After next, this summer, maybe the fall. We'll see if this meeting with Manchin and Biden is going to be really big. It's really going to tell us whether or not you have some real traction. When it comes to getting Manchin on board or not. Because I mean, honestly, who cares? If the corporate taxes are really the only thing, then fine. Leave them at 25% instead of 28%, which is what Biden wants. Who cares? Spend the money. It's a slam dunk. So I kind of think that may happen, but the fact that that's even having a hard time spells very dark. It spells very pessimistic to me outlook for these other bills that reconciliation can't be applied to. Now, as I mentioned before, Mark Warner, or circling back to Mark Warner, concerns about the PRO Act. So Mark Warner is a very rich, I think he's actually said he's the richest member of Congress, which says a lot. The members of Congress are worth $100 million. So he's very rich. He's a very rich member of Congress who's a senator from Virginia. I think he was elected back when Virginia was a little more purple than it is now. It's still pretty suburban, but it's not nearly as purple as it used to be. And he has some issues with the PRO Act. And I want to bring up the article about that because there's some very specific points he brings up. But just generally speaking, he has some issues with this. He says that the lion's share of it, I love most of it. There's just some small issues I have, that we need to look at. So yeah, see Mark's support, and they relate to the gig economy, as you can see on the screen right here. So there you go, and then more Andrew Yang stuff. Oh, that's a good in a second. So, yeah, vast majority of the PRO Act. We need to recognize the changing nature of work. Now, what he's talking about are gig jobs. He's talking about Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, that kind of stuff. And basically, he wants to carve out some ability for them to have their quote unquote independent contractors like we have here in California. Now, what that means, practically speaking, is people considered to be independent contractors don't get the same worker rights protections, overtime stuff, even something like minimum wage isn't necessarily guaranteed or not in the same way that a regular person. So if I sign up to the Uber app and I sit and I wait for calls and I take calls for 40 hours, I'm not guaranteed a wage on 40 hours of labor. My labor is only the actual driving I'm doing. And that's because I'm an independent contractor. So that's the type of stuff that's different. And so obviously labor advocates aren't in favor of this because my waiting around, that's costing my time. And when you pay someone, you're paying them for your time. So he likes to say things like that. He actually, and I thought it was pretty cute for the richest member of Congress to say that, what if one of my kids, wants to do a gig job? Like any of his kids are ever going to drive an Uber. Considering his wealth, it seems pretty ridiculous. So what he wants to do, I'm just thinking to have it here, is he wants to create other ways to, what I want to get is how we can make some of the areas where I'd like to see some corrections. So this very expansive piece of legislation could be supported on the floor. He says the dramatic change in our social safety net that says no matter what kind of work you do, starting with the first hour of work, there ought to be benefits attached. See, what he's saying is, he's talking about, he mentions down here, portable benefits. Here it is. So he wants to essentially kind of create a way that you could have benefits for, so that people who are doing gig jobs could get separate benefits. Now, in theory, one thing you have to understand about him is he's actually kind of conservative. So he's not talking about Medicare for all. That's the most portable benefit, right? When it comes to healthcare, because healthcare is another thing that independent contractors generally either don't have access to, or the access is very limited. And so when he talks about portable, benefits, he's talking about basically having the government provide benefits in lieu of, which essentially means you are externalizing the cost of labor in part of these gig corporations to the federal government. Now, the form it takes may vary. Like, I'm all in favor of Medicare for all because basically it's more efficient. Every other rich nation in the world guarantees healthcare for all of their citizens. We're the richest nation in the world. We can afford it. It will actually cost less, and more of the money would actually go to people rather than the intermediaries, which are the very rich healthcare healthcare insurance providers. That's the middleman. They don't actually do anything besides shuffle paper and spend money and have actualization into tables to determine who they want to cover and how much. They're the corporatized death panels, right? We don't need them. We can do without them. We'll save money. We'll have better health outcomes, right? So if he wants to do that, I'm all for it. But I don't think that's what he's talking about. He's probably talking about vouchers for private healthcare insurance agencies. Very vague. So it's not even clear what he's really saying. He's just saying, I want to support externalizing the cost of labor for gig economy corporations rather than actually having them pay for it, because there is a way you could do that. There's a way you could actually have gig companies and have them pay a fine or a fee or some different special kind of tax for having independent contractors that would then pay for portable benefits for their independent contractors. Probably not what he's talking about, but that's his problem with the PRO Act. Is the PRO Act goes the other way. It gives those independent contractors, those so-called independent contractors, even ones like in California now, has a whole different set, especially of independent contractors just for gig employees. It gives them ability to form unions and to fight for rights. And that's the thing he doesn't want. He doesn't want to give them the ability to become employees, to fight for better benefits. And he wants to basically give the gig economies, gig corporations, an out, and then on the back end have the United States government try to make those people whole for all the stuff they're not getting being independent contractors. So that's what he wants to do. And the other side of it is, again, if you like the lion's share of it, even if you have a particular issue with this, aren't you going to, if the vast majority of it is good, or are you going to do what Clyburn says Congressman Clyburn says we shouldn't do, and throw away the good because it's not perfect? That's the thing. That's the funny thing about being a senator, is that you can be a stinker about whatever you want. You can, and oftentimes when it's done from a conservative standpoint, it's done from hey, this might be too tough on those gig corporations. The media often kind of gives you a pass on it, doesn't really hold your feet to the fire. But if you're saying, let's say, an infrastructure bill, and Democrats come out and say, or some progressive Democrats or progressives in general come out and say, you know what, we're going to submarine that if you don't put the minimum wage in it. We're going to submarine it. Do you think they would get the same kind of soft-handed treatment that someone like a Mark Warner or a Joe Manchin gets, when they try to, gum up the works from a conservative standpoint? Probably not. They would be called obstructionists and impractical, and all manner of weight would come down on their heads. But just look, this is a conservative Democrat from a conservative standpoint, potentially holding up an important bill that would improve the lives of millions of Americans and would enable more Americans to unionize and to fight for their own rights as workers. And this guy, Mark Warner, doesn't seem to want to let him do it. He seems to be willing to gum up the works if we don't cut out something for big corporations. Anyway, so I got one more thing left, and actually relates to this tweet. So Alex Thompson I'm going to put this back up here. Alex Thompson is Alex Thompson here works for Politico as a reporter. And he wrote an article recently about Elizabeth Warren and how she's probably running for Congress, for Senate again in 2024. One thing I think he did not put in the article, but he tweeted here, like right before he released the article, was when Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal called Elizabeth Warren to explain her decision to endorse Bernie for president. This was back in January, I believe. Jayapal told others, like in her circle, that she felt Warren had questioned her feminism, according to a person Jayapal told at the time. This happened soon after the Women Can't Win story broke between her and Bernie. Now, I don't know. Elizabeth Warren is generally one of my favorite Congress members, our favorite senators. There are not a lot of really good senators that I agree a lot with in Congress. Most of them are very conservative, very old, and stuck in their ways. She's one that seems to have a sincere interest of working Americans at heart and had some pretty good ideas for making that happen. But her personality and some quirks about her personality have come up several times now. Because this, to me, Jayapal did not have to call her up and say anything to her. She is an independent congresswoman whose opinions more align with Bernie Sanders anyway. But she takes the time to call up Elizabeth Warren to let her know. Elizabeth Warren could have been gracious and said, I appreciate you giving me a call. I'm disappointed that you did not endorse me, but I wish you the best. And they have worked together since then. So even despite this tweet, she hasn't been so petty as to not work with Jayapal or anything like that. But it's still disappointing that her reaction was to lash out at Congresswoman Jayapal rather than being understanding, which you would hope these people who are generally do have pretty similar beliefs about politics would be able to do. Instead, it seemed like she lashed out in that Senator Warren has a chip on her shoulder a bit about supporting fellow women. And I remember, I think at the time in 2016, she endorsed Hillary over Bernie, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure about that. I take that back. She stayed out of it. She did not, even though her politics were much closer to Bernie, that people were calling for her to support Bernie. She stayed out of it and then endorsed Hillary once it was clear that Hillary had the nomination. And this kind of gives a lens into why that's something that, and maybe in her book Persist, she talks a lot about her struggles as a woman, and maybe that affected her very profoundly. And that's why we've seen this numerous times, how important it seems to her to support other female politicians, even if you don't agree with them as much. And I think as a citizen who wants my government to represent me as closely as possible, it's a little disappointing. I understand where she's coming from. But of course, I'd rather she went along with her politics and went along with the actual agenda that she has, because I support her as much as I do because of her agenda. And that's the thing that's going to help us or hurt us in terms of citizens, is what agenda moves forward in Congress and on the part of our government. So it's a little disappointing to me that is definitely a hurdle for her and something that she lends a lot of weight to, even if it's in contradiction, with her agenda. So that's it. That is it. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for a couple of people coming in towards the end. I appreciate you checking out my stream and talking to me, or not talking to me. Text me if you want to have any comments, post any comments. You want me to answer anything or have any comments or notes. Just want to say hi. Feel free to. But I appreciate everybody for stopping by and checking out my stream. And I stream every Thursday, generally between 5 and 7 p.m. And thanks, everybody, for checking out Democracy in the News for May 13th, 2021. Have a great evening.